Welcome to the first ever Workshop Wednesday class. So today we get to chat about necklines, and you sent in so many questions. I'll try and get to as many as we can. I wanted to also leave some space for Q&A if there's extra questions from people joining in live, to make sure that we get to those ones, and then I will try and return to any other questions that got missed on a later date and fit them in. Some of the questions, though, I will mention, did have to do more with pattern drafting. So I'm thinking later in the month we'll do a pattern drafting type Workshop Wednesday. So if you don't, though, currently have a question, if I could just ask you to actually mute your microphone, that would be great, just because it will provide a clearer recording. Yeah, so I wanted to start off just with a few examples here. I have my mannequins ready to go. And I noticed, though, once I turned on my camera, that since this garment is such a light color, it's a little bit hard to see, but I'm just going to turn it to the side profile, because a lot of times one of the main questions that I get is necklines that are gaping. And I know I touched on this in the email that I sent out on Monday, is because necklines are cut so often on a bias, especially when it's a V-neck, they stretch out really, really easily. You can kind of see it's a light blue lining on the inside. Might actually be easier to see from this angle. Yeah, you can see that this is just standing up, flying away. And in the case of this dress, it's actually just the one side that's doing it. It's not the other side. So when you have one side that's having an issue, it's most likely that it did get stretched out. There is also the case that you need to adjust the pattern. I mentioned that a gaping neckline, there's always too much length somewhere. And today, and in this kind of option, especially if it's the one side, it would be that this side is stretched out. So the good news about this is that you can definitely shorten it up after the fact. Sometimes just the way you iron it will do the trick, and you can shorten up that length. But sometimes you'll need to open up the seam and iron it, press it back to length, and then close it again, just because it got stretched out so much during the stitching process. That's why this length, this side is standing up. So when it comes to, I just have a little note here from a question I had from Dawn, actually sent in. She was wondering if I close the shoulder seam before or after you do the binding on the neckline. And I do both. So why I do both is because it depends on what you think the purpose of the garment will be, and if you think you're going to need to adjust it. If you think you may need to adjust the shoulder seam at any point, definitely put the binding on first, because then it will be open on the shoulder and it will be much easier to do an adjustment later. If you put the binding on after, and then take in the shoulder seam, your binding is going to be too long, and then you'll have to put a seam in and it'll just be really bulky. So if I think that, especially for like a kid's garment or even for an adult, if I think that I may adjust the shoulder seam at some point, then I would definitely put the binding on the neckline first and then close the shoulder seam. The one drawback with that, especially if you have a binding that you see on the outside that isn't just tucked on the inside, is that you'll see the seam. So if you don't like the seam, you may want to put the binding on afterwards, but definitely try on the garment then first. If you've tried it on and you know that the length of the shoulders is perfect, then you can put the binding on confidently, and you know you're not going to have to mess around with it again later. Another question that Dawn had, she sent in two. She was wondering about measuring the length of how low your necklines are and adjusting that. So today I'm going to talk about measuring the length of how low you want your neckline, and how you can measure that and see if your pattern is going to be the right length or too low or too high, but we're going to have to get into the details of adjusting patterns on a different day just for the sake of time, because that is a little bit more of a intensive walk through. Now, here we are. I'm just going to use this mannequin again for showing you how you can measure a length. Always measure from the side of your neck straight down. And then when you have a 45-degree angle, you can find the depth of your neckline. So if you know you love the depth of this, but you wouldn't want to go any deeper because it just wouldn't be comfortable for you, and you want to double check that you're not cutting your pattern too low. As we all know, there's no going back once you've cut a neckline. Then you'll want to just measure, or even on yourself, and then directly the depth. So here, this neckline is 22 centimeters. I'm just going to go with centimeters today, but it really doesn't matter. It's about 9 inches, a little bit. 9 inches is a little bit lower. So we'll go with 22 centimeters. I'm just going to show you on a piece here. We'll change the view for a moment. So just imagine with me that this is the neckline. This is the shoulder seam of our pattern piece. This is the front middle on the fold. Now that I know that the depth of my perfect neckline is 22 centimeters, I love these squares for measuring just because it makes it easy. Go to your pattern. Now I've already marked in the stitch line because you'll want to measure from your stitch line since that's what we measured on our mannequin. And I've also marked in the stitch line on the neck hole itself. And you can see here that we have a different width of seam allowance. Whenever I'm measuring patterns, I always love to mark in the stitch lines if they're not already there, just because it makes measuring a lot easier. So if I drop down straight from my shoulder seam to the point of where my neckline is at a 45-degree angle, I can see that this neckline is actually just about 20.5 centimeters low. So this neckline, this pattern, is actually going to be a little bit higher than my pre-existing garment that I know that I love the neckline already on. So I'm just going to quickly admit we have a couple more people joining. Welcome to the newbies. I'm just chatting about how to measure the depth of the neckline right now. And I will be posting this recording in the Facebook group so you can catch up on what you already missed. So there we go. That's as easy as it is to measure the depth of the neckline. At this point, I can decide if I want to cut my piece out with the neckline a little bit higher and see how that suits me, or if I want to do the adjustment to bring it down another 2 centimeters to make it like my original garment. And as I mentioned, I will be going over how to do that adjustment on a future workshop Wednesday. So let's just pop back up again to look at a couple more pieces. So I have another totally different neckline here. And as you can see, that this side is laying a whole lot better than this side already. And it's kind of funny, I always recommend if you are doing something symmetrical, so whatever it is, whether it be darts, whether it be putting in a pocket, whatever it is, if you're creating a symmetrical effect on your garment, then do the sides right after each other. Don't completely do the left side from start to finish and then start the right side. There's always going to be a little bit of variation. It's pretty difficult to get things to sit 100% the same. One side will always look a little bit different or a little bit better. But if you do them right away, the same step, right and left, you'll be more likely to get a unified look on your garment. But again, here we have the neckline and we can see that this extra piece on the side is just puckering where it's stitched on, and it's also not laying nicely. Again here, it's too much length. And for this piece, it's too much length on the edge and it's too much length where it's attached to the top. So really the problem here is that this piece is too long. They stitched it on too long when they added it to the garment, and that also created the wobbly edge. You know, there's too much length just because of the wobble, in that the length has to go somewhere, right? So it's going up and down instead of laying flat. So really the only thing that you can do to fix this would be to take this right off and take out some of that length. And it's amazing how easily you can add extra length to something by accidentally. I know sometimes when you're trying to ease pieces together and it's a seam where you are trying to attach a longer piece to a smaller piece, it can be really tricky to get it on there without it making any kind of pleats or buckles. But even unintentionally, depending on how it's feeding through the machine, if you're tugging one layer a little bit more than the other layer, it's amazing how quickly something like this can occur and really just mess up the entire look of your product. I had to dive into my closet of ready-made stuff and find some garments that had issues with necklines so that I could have some samples just to show you, to chat about. I definitely also wanted to say today, I know we are our own worst critic, but it's really funny when you start actually looking at your wardrobe of ready-made bought pieces that you think are fine and you're more critical of your own sewing, that when you actually start to look at things, you'll notice so many times there's little things like that, like this neckline, that are just not sewn quite 100% properly either. So take it, be easy on yourself and realize that nobody's perfect. Even ready-made garments aren't perfect. So I just have to stretch here since I'm tethered. Here we have another top, and I wanted to talk quickly about bias bindings and rounded necklines. Now, whenever you're working with a woven fabric, you always have to cut bindings on the bias, obviously, because we need a shorter edge on the inside than we do on the outside. And that will help you shape it without getting any kind of puckering. However, on knits, and this is a knit piece, it can be kind of tricky because you can't do a bias binding. So on bias, or on knit, sorry, the one thing that you can though do to control having the outer edge a little bit smaller than the inner edge is easing it onto the neckline. Now, you always have to be careful with easing that you don't do too much that the garment is then puckering when you are just stretching the binding a little bit where you attach it, but you will be able to tell how much you can actually ease on depending on the fabric. There's no kind of calculation, unfortunately, that I can give you that says you can easily ease this much on. It really depends on how stretchy your material is and how heavy it is. Typically, a heavier material will start to pucker a lot earlier. Now, we did have another question. A couple of people actually sent in and mentioned that they have trouble with garments standing up at the back of the neck. Again, when a garment is standing up at the back of the neck, it's just too much length along this edge. The one thing that makes adjusting the back of the neck a little bit trickier is it's not just the too much length like on our straight pieces. It also has to do with the curvature of your spine and your shoulders. So here we've got some curves going on. So as we know, around the bust, you have to have darts to shape your 2D material into a 3D garment. And the same goes for the back of a shirt. If you have a seam in the middle, it's easy, you can easily take it out. But if you don't, which is oftentimes the case, it can be a little bit tricky to know where should that material come out of the neckline and how can I create a little bit of a curve and rounding. Oftentimes, if you pin little darts, then it will sit properly, but you don't necessarily want darts in the back of your neck in all of your tops. I'm sure you've noticed oftentimes on blouses and woven materials, they will have a yoke at the back. A yoke is not only a decorative piece, but a yoke can also help you mold the shoulder area and the neck area to the curves of your back and how it is shaped as well. Even though the seam could look straight, you can take extra material out just like a dart in the bust, can be on the side under the bust going into the armhole. The dart that you would just pin of the extra material from the neck hole, you can actually take that material out in a yoke as well. However, if you're wanting to make a t-shirt, then the best way to take that extra material out is actually at the shoulder seam. So you won't want to take the material from the front and the back piece, you'll only want to take it from the back piece. Oftentimes when we are taking things in, we'll take it in symmetrically on both seams, but in this case, you'll only want to take it from the back piece. Being that t-shirts do have some stretch, even though they have varying amounts of stretch, that may be enough. Just taking a little tuck from the shoulder seam and fading it out as you go along, just to tighten that edge and bring it in. Now, that may not always work with a woven material. It may pull, so you'll have to give it a try. If you're a little bit unsure, the nice thing about that is we're taking material out, so you can cut the pattern in the original form and adjust it by the time you can try it on. So before you close the shoulder seam, just pin it closed and try it on the piece and see how much do you need to take from the back, and does the rest of the garment still lay properly. You can also start reshaping the back neck hole somewhat. Now, if you're adding a collar or something like that, it can get a little bit more complicated. And again, then we're getting into a lot more of pattern adjusting. So we're not really going to talk about adjusting the neck hole, but you can shorten the length of the neck hole by adjusting the shape of it and maybe flattening it out a little bit or that kind of thing too. And just bring that top edge in tighter. That is what's going to help you get your neck hole to lay properly in the back as well. Okay, so I'm just going to take a quick peek at the chat. It's always a little tricky for me to keep an eye on the chat, even though I love it when you guys do comment in the chat. I love to just read it real quickly after. And so pop in where you're joining us from, and definitely if you do have any other questions. Oh, we have someone that can't hear. Can you guys, can anybody hear me right now? I'm guessing that some people can. Yeah, Chris, awesome, thank you. Okay. Oh, from England, so it's evening time for you. Yeah, so I just wanted to also show you really quick how you can measure the depth of a neckline, a pre-existing neckline on a piece when you're not wearing it, as that is also sometimes easier than trying to measure the depth. So here I have a top and I folded it in the front middle. As we know, we always cut the front middle on a fold unless we have an opening. So here I folded the garment on the front middle, and I'm just going to bring that extra material to tuck it underneath the back so that my piece is flat here. You can see that the neck hole in the back is a little bit higher. That's often the case. And you just want to make sure that your shoulder seam is right at the fold. So the shoulder seam is right at the fold, and that you really do truly have the front middle, so everything's squared off really nicely. In this case, you can easily, with a ruler, just quickly measure the depth of the neckline as well. But even if you don't have a squared ruler, you can easily use a measuring tape to kind of mark your lines. Just make sure that you do stay nice and square when measuring the depth. I love to measure my garments, my favorite garments, pre-existing garments, and that takes a lot of the just the risk out of creating a new piece. If you measure pieces you already know and love, then you know you're going to love your new pieces once you create them. So I always recommend, even for trying to figure out how much ease, measure your existing wardrobe, your favorite pieces, and you'll be way further ahead in knowing if the new piece you're creating is going to need a lot of adjustments, or if you're going to really like it right from the get-go. So I just want to check here quick if there are any extra tips. Does anybody have any other tip or question that they would like to hear today before we head out? I wanted to kind of keep the live sessions at about 20 minutes so that they don't get too long. But I want to make sure that all of your questions do get answered if you have one. If nobody has any other questions, then I look forward to seeing you next week. And as I mentioned, it will be the same time, same place, and I will let you know what the topic will be on. So if you have any questions, you can email those in or bring them to class right away. Thanks for joining me today. Have a great one. Bye.